72 years. Sometimes it feels like I've lived all of my 72 years just to be standing here on this very porch with my hand resting on the wooden rail my husband, Henry, sanded down himself 20 years ago. Just standing here, watching my son's silver SUV disappear down the red dirt road. The dust kicks up, painting the Shenandoah Valley's early summer air a hazy gold before slowly settling, returning the quiet to our Orchard Crest apple farm. Well, not ours. Mine. It's just mine now. Now, you remember to water the roses, Mom, and don't forget to feed the chickens, my daughter-in-law Brenda called out from the rolled-down window. Her smile was bright, but it never quite reached her eyes. It was a practiced smile, like that expensive linen dress she was wearing, completely out of place for farm life. Ethan, my son, just gave a tight nod from behind the wheel. "We'll call you, Mom," he said, but his eyes were already on the rearview mirror, like he was in a hurry to get away from something. I knew what that something was. It was my gaze. I'd spent the whole week washing their clothes, ironing every shirt, and packing up boxes of food for their long trip to the Outer Banks, a trip that didn't have room for me. I picked the best apples from the early harvest and made the same apple pie Ethan's loved since he was a boy. I did it all with the love of a mother, a grandmother. But seeing their suitcases piled high in the trunk, it hit me. In their eyes, I was nothing more than an unpaid housekeeper, a diligent gardener hired to look after the property while the masters were away. 72 years of carrying this family on my shoulders, and this is the thanks I get? The car vanished behind the oak ridge, leaving me alone with a silence so deep it ached. The wind rustled through the apple leaves, and the old rooster crowed from his coop. These were the sounds of my life, but today they sounded hollow and strange. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and ripening apples. What would Henry say if he were here? He'd put his arm around my shoulder, give it a little squeeze, and say, "Don't you worry, sweetheart, they're just kids." But Ethan's 45 years old. He's no kid anymore. 2 days later, June came by. Her old pickup truck rattled down the familiar lane, and her arrival was like a fresh breeze cutting through the heavy air that had been suffocating me. June's my best friend, a retired librarian who knows the history of every family in this town, backwards and forwards. She walked up the porch steps with a still warm blueberry pie in her hands and that kind smile she always wears. "You've got a long face," June said, skipping the pleasantries as she sat down in the wicker chair across from me. That's what I love about June. She always could see right through me. I just shrugged and poured us both a cup of chamomile tea. "Just feeling a little lonely is all, with the kids on vacation. This house is too big for just one person." June took a sip of her tea, her sharp eyes studying me over her glasses. "Alice," she started, hesitating a little, "I don't know if I should be telling you this. I don't want to worry you, but—" "What is it, June? Just spit it out." She set her cup down, folding her hands on the table. "Last week, when I was at the library, I saw Ethan. He was in the parking lot having a very intense conversation with some fella in a suit. This man, he didn't look like he was from around here. Drove a fancy car with the logo of a big real estate developer on the side." A little pang went through my heart, but I tried to keep my face calm. "Probably just business. Ethan's in real estate, you know." June shook her head. "Maybe, but that's not all. 2 days later, I was having lunch at the Gilded Spoon, and I saw Brenda. She was with Lawyer Thompson. Lawyer Thompson, the man with billboards all over the highway about securing your family's assets. He has a reputation in these parts for handling big, messy land disputes, usually on the side of the corporations." "What was Brenda saying?" I asked, my voice a little shaky now. "I couldn't hear much," June admitted, "but I heard 2 phrases clear as day. One was mental competency evaluation, and the other was guardianship. I don't know who they were talking about, Alice, but I've got a real bad feeling about it. A bad feeling. My whole body went cold. The teacup in my hand suddenly felt like a block of ice. Competency evaluation? Guardianship? The words were like needles pricking at my mind. I forced a smile. Oh, they were probably just worried about one of Brenda's clients. She manages a clinic after all. June didn't say another word. She just looked at me with those knowing, sympathetic eyes. She knew I was just trying to soothe myself. We moved on to other things, our book club, her grandkids, the coming apple harvest. But my mind wasn't there anymore. June's words had planted a seed of doubt, and it was starting to take root. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the crickets chirping outside. June's words echoed in my ears. Alone in the dark, the pieces started to fall into place, forming a terrifying picture. I thought about Brenda, about how she'd suddenly become so concerned about my health these past few months. Last month, she brought over a big, fancy-looking bottle of pills. "Just some vitamins to keep you sharp, Mom. It's time you took better care of yourself," she'd said, her voice sweet as honey. "I did a lot of research. You have to take one every day. I'll leave it out for you at breakfast." And I did. I took them. But after, I started noticing my mind felt fuzzy, especially in the mornings. I told myself it was just old age, that I wasn't as quick as I used to be. But now, with my years as a retired nurse, an alarm bell went off in my head. This feeling, it wasn't natural aging. It felt like something was being done to me. Then I thought about Ethan. I remembered that evening 2 weeks ago when he was watching me sort through some papers in the kitchen. "Mom," he'd asked, his voice hesitant, his eyes avoiding mine, "where do you keep the original deed to the farm, the very first one? I just want to make sure it's stored somewhere safe." At the time, I thought my son was just being thoughtful. I showed him Henry's old safe. But looking back, I remembered how nervous and fidgety he was. He didn't seem like a son concerned about his family's legacy. He seemed like a thief casing the joint. Competency evaluation, guardianship, a land lawyer, memory vitamins, the original deed. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking it, but the doubt was a rising tide. The picture was becoming crystal clear. Their plan was a two-pronged attack, one on my health and one on the farm's legal standing. And I knew where I had to start. The first step was to find out about those pills. That morning, I went down to the kitchen and saw the vitamin bottle sitting right next to my water glass, just as Brenda had left it. I picked up the pill, a harmless-looking off-white capsule. I slipped it into an empty spice jar and hid it deep in the pantry. I needed proof, but more than that, I needed my mind back. After just 2 days of not taking the pill, the difference was like night and day. The fog in my mind started to lift. My thoughts were clearer. I could remember little details I'd been forgetting. I could finish the crossword puzzle in the newspaper without getting stuck. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. They were poisoning me, slowly, turning me into a shadow in my own home. On the third day, I drove my old pickup into town. I went to the independent pharmacy run by Mr. Peterson, an old pharmacist I'd known for years from a medical seminar. "Alice," he said, surprised to see me. "Been a long time. What brings you all the way out here?" I handed him the jar with the 3 pills I'd saved. "Pete," I said, my voice serious, "I need you to do me a favor. I need you to analyze this and tell me exactly what it is. Don't ask why. Just chalk it up to an old woman being overly cautious about her health." Mr. Peterson looked at me, and his wise old eyes seemed to understand something was wrong. He didn't ask another question. "Leave it with me. Come back tomorrow." On the drive home, I didn't feel scared. I felt a cold resolve. That evening, I went down to the basement. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth, old wood, and forgotten memories. I found the oak chest that Henry always called his Pandora's box, where he kept the most important papers, the things he called the soul of this land. I opened the rusty lock. Inside was a mess of yellow documents. I spent hours sifting through them. Land grants, old tax bills, records on the apple varietals he'd worked so hard to cultivate. But a wife's intuition told me what I was looking for wasn't on the surface. I remembered late-night talks with Henry. He always spoke of our responsibility to this valley. He'd fought tooth and nail against a factory project years ago, not because it was near our farm, but because he was worried it would pollute the groundwater. "This land isn't just ours, Alice," he'd said. "It's part of something much bigger. We're just its caretakers for a little while." Driven by that memory, I dug deeper into the thicker files. And then I found it. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a folder with a neatly typed label: Land Conservation Easement, Orchard Crest. My heart started to pound. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were detailed geological maps of the farm, soil composition analyses I'd never seen before. And then I read the words that changed everything. My husband, with the help of a geologist, had discovered a massive deposit of bentonite clay deep beneath our apple orchards, a rare, valuable mineral deposit worth millions of dollars. But instead of being thrilled, Henry had been horrified. The report was clear. Mining the clay would require a tremendous amount of water and ran a high risk of permanently poisoning the aquifer, the very lifeblood for every farm in the valley. So he did something about it. He had quietly worked with a conservation trust to establish a land conservation easement. It was a permanent legal agreement that forbade any mining, industrial construction, or any other activity that could harm the farm's ecosystem. This land was to remain farmland and green space forever. And then I saw the fatal clause, the kind of thing only a man as careful and cautious as Henry would think of. Due to a change in state law, the easement had to be renewed by the landowner every 25 years. If it wasn't, it would automatically expire. I scrambled to the last page, searching for the date it was signed. My hands went cold. The easement was signed on August 15th, 25 years ago. Today was August 10th. I had 5 days left. The deadline was this weekend. It all came crashing down on me. The vacation, the pills, their hurry. It was all aimed at one single goal: to make me forget or be too confused to renew the easement on time. Once it expired, they'd get guardianship over a senile old woman. And then they'd be free to sign a deal with the devil to sell the soul of this land. They were going to destroy my husband's legacy, poison the land of our ancestors, and ruin the lives of the neighbors we'd shared our lives with. The next morning, I went back to Mr. Peterson's pharmacy. His face was grim. "Alice," he said quietly, pulling me into his private office, "this isn't a vitamin. It's a low-dose sedative, lorazepam. It's a small dose, but taken regularly, it can cause confusion, short-term memory loss, and drowsiness. It's prescription only. Who gave this to you?" "Thank you, Pete," I said, my voice frighteningly calm. "You've helped me more than you'll ever know. Please, keep this between us." I put the lab report in my purse. My next call was to Walter Miller, Henry's best friend and our lawyer for 40 years. I kept it simple. "Walter, I need you to file the renewal for the Orchard Crest Conservation Easement immediately. It's an emergency." His voice was surprised, but he didn't pry. "I'm on it, Alice. Is everything all right?" "We'll talk later, Walter. Just get it done." Next, I went to the bank. I sat down with the young branch manager, a woman named Sarah. I told her I was concerned about my account security. I had her put a special alert on my accounts. Any transaction over $500 or any attempt to change beneficiary information required a direct video call confirmation with me. No exception, Sarah, not even if it's my own son. Sarah looked concerned, but she did as I asked. She even printed me a log of recent online access to my accounts. Just as I suspected, there were dozens of logins from an IP address registered to Ethan's real estate firm. That evening, I got out the small camera Henry used to use to film birds nesting in the garden. I placed it carefully on the bookshelf in the living room, hiding amongst the old books. It had a perfect view of the sofa and coffee table, right where I knew the final showdown would happen. I turned on the recording and started to wait. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, the familiar silver SUV rolled up the red dirt road. I was out in the garden pruning my roses. When the engine cut off, I calmly took off my gardening gloves, dusted the dirt from my apron, and went inside. I had a pitcher of iced tea ready, as if it were just another Saturday afternoon. Ethan and Brenda walked in, their faces plastered with fake cheer. They brought souvenirs from the beach, a large conch shell for me, some toys for the grandchildren who never visit. "How have you been, Mom?" Brenda asked, her voice so sweet it made my stomach turn. "The trip was wonderful, but we were worried about you here all alone." "I've been just fine," I said, my voice even. "Iced tea?" They sat down on the living room sofa, right in my little camera's line of sight. It silently recorded everything. "Mom," Ethan began, his voice a little shaky. "Actually, we have some really exciting news for you." He glanced at Brenda, as if for backup. Brenda took the lead. "We do, Mom. On our trip, Ethan met a major investor. He's very interested in the potential of our valley." She said it like she was a city planner, not a con artist. "He's going to be stopping by in about an hour to talk to you about an opportunity, a wonderful opportunity for you to have a comfortable retirement with no more worries." An opportunity? I almost laughed out loud. I just nodded, pretending to listen intently. "Is that so? Well, that sounds nice." An hour later, a black luxury car pulled up. A man in a suit got out, carrying a leather briefcase. It was Lawyer Thompson, the man June had seen. He walked in with a slick professional smile, shaking my hand like we were old friends. "Mrs. Alice, a pleasure to finally meet you," he said. "I've heard so much about you from Ethan and Brenda. You have a magnificent property here." I invited him to sit. Brenda poured him tea while Ethan sat stiffly, his hands clasped together, slick with sweat. Thompson opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick file. "Mrs. Alice," he began, his voice official, "I represent an investment group interested in the sustainable development of this region. We've become aware that your farm sits on a unique geological potential, specifically a high-quality bentonite clay deposit." He said it like he was granting me a favor. "We are prepared to make you an offer of $8 million for the mining rights to this land." $8 million? The number just hung in the air. I saw Ethan's eyes light up with greed, and a triumphant smile spread across Brenda's face. Brenda put her hand on mine, her voice dripping with false concern. "See, Mom? $8 million. You could sell the farm, buy a fancy condo in the city, travel the world, no more hard work." She turned to Thompson. "But, Mr. Thompson, there is a small issue. My mother, her health hasn't been the best lately. Her memory can be a bit unreliable. That's why we're in the process of filing for guardianship, just to ensure that all decisions made are in her best interest." There it was, the confession perfectly disguised. Thompson nodded with fake sympathy. "I understand, but to expedite the process, perhaps Mrs. Alice could sign this memorandum of understanding today. It's just a document of good faith, so we can begin the legal proceedings." He pushed the contract and a gold-plated fountain pen across the table toward me. All eyes were on me. I didn't look at the contract. Instead, I slowly stood up and walked over to the small table by the fireplace. I turned back around with 3 things in my hand. I placed them, one by one, on the coffee table, right between the contract and the golden pen. The first, the lab report from Mr. Peterson's pharmacy, with the word lorazepam circled in red. The second, a copy of the land conservation easement with the clauses forbidding mining highlighted in yellow. And the third, and final item, the stamped receipt from the county clerk's office confirming that the easement had been successfully renewed yesterday and was now legally binding for another 25 years. I sat back down and looked straight at Brenda. My voice was calm and cold as ice. "You were going to use this," I said, pointing to the lab report, "to make me confused enough to miss the deadline for this," I pointed to the easement, "so that I would sign that. Isn't that right?" A heavy silence fell over the room. You could have heard a pin drop. The smile on Brenda's face froze, then shattered like a glass mask. Her face went from a healthy pink to a sickly white. Lawyer Thompson's jaw dropped. His eyes darted between the papers on the table, beads of sweat popping up on his forehead. He realized he wasn't closing a lucrative deal. He was an accessory to criminal fraud. Ethan was the first to break. He stared at the papers, then at me, his eyes wide with horror and guilt. "Mom," he stammered. "Mom, how did you know?" "I know because I'm your mother, Ethan," I said, my voice now filled not with coldness, but with a deep, aching pain. "I know because I've spent my entire life looking out for you. And what you've done, it's a disappointment I don't have words for." Lawyer Thompson scrambled to his feet, clumsily gathering his papers. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I wasn't aware of any of this. I retract the offer." He scurried out of the house like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. That left the three of us. Brenda finally found her voice, but it was laced with fury. "You ruined everything. It could have all been ours. $8 million. All because of some stubborn, dying old woman." Ethan turned to his wife, and for the first time, I saw him look at her with something other than adoration. It was disgust. "Shut up, Brenda. You lied to me. You said this was what was best for Mom." "Best for us," Brenda shrieked. He roared, his voice cracking with shock and anger. "No, you're sick." Brenda flinched, stunned by the sudden attack. "Ethan, I'm asking you. You lied to me, didn't you?" Ethan shot to his feet, pointing at the lab report on the table. "You told me those were vitamins, memory enhancers. You swore to me." He advanced on her, his voice trembling with a chaotic mix of rage and self-recrimination. "You're the one in the medical field. You showed me charts, articles. You told me Mom was losing her mind, that she was in danger living alone, that we were helping her. Helping her, do you understand?" Brenda took a step back, a flash of panic in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by cold contempt. "Helping her?" she sneered. "Don't you play innocent, Ethan. You knew exactly what we were doing. You were just too much of a coward to admit it." She stood up to face him. "Or are you just now growing a conscience because you see $8 million flying out the window? You wanted that money just as much as I did." "It wasn't like that," Ethan yelled, running his hands through his hair. I just wanted to get out of debt. I didn't want to poison my own mother." And then, in the middle of all that chaos, faced with the raw truth and his wife's unmasked cruelty, Ethan just broke. His last bit of strength crumbled. He fell to his knees on the floor, buried his face in his hands, and began to sob like a little boy. "I'm sorry, Mom," he choked out between sobs. I'm in so much debt. Gambling. I lost everything. Brenda said this was the only way. She found out about the clay, about the easement expiring. She said if we didn't do this, I'd lose it all. I'd go to jail. I was so scared." For a moment, Brenda just stood there, frozen. She was in disbelief, not because their crimes were exposed, but at the weakness of her accomplice. She couldn't believe her husband was betraying their plan with a tearful confession. "Ethan, what are you saying? Shut your mouth," she hissed, rushing over and trying to pull him to his feet. But Ethan just shook his head, lost in his own desperate sobs. Get up, you weakling," Brenda screamed, her voice now full of contempt and panic. She looked at me, then back at Ethan, realizing the game was well and truly over. "You've ruined everything. You confessed. You fool. You've destroyed it all for a little bit of cheap guilt." His confession brought me no joy. It only broke my heart further. My son, the boy I raised, had become a coward, led by greed and fear, a puppet on the strings of a heartless woman. I stood up and walked over to Brenda, who was still standing there, panting with pure hatred in her eyes. I didn't slap her. I didn't scream at her. I said just 4 words, clear and final. Get out of my house. She stared at me for a second, maybe searching for a crack in my resolve. She found none. She turned, knocking over a chair on her way out, and stormed out the door, slamming it behind her with a bang that sounded like a final gunshot. I turned back to Ethan, my 45-year-old son, still kneeling and crying on my floor. The storm had passed, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. The living room was turtled in a heavy silence after Brenda's door slam. All that was left was the sound of Ethan's choked sobs, a pathetic echo in the empty space. I didn't go to him. I left him there, kneeling on the floor, in his own shame and brokenness. Sometimes a man has to hit rock bottom before he can even think about climbing back up. After a long while, his crying subsided into ragged, hitching breaths. He lifted his head, his face blotchy and swollen. He couldn't look me in the eye. His gaze was fixed on the oak floorboards his father had once polished by hand. "What are you going to do to me?" he asked, his voice raw. "Are you going to call the police?" That question, the question of a child afraid of being punished, made me realize the problem ran deeper than I thought. Ethan hadn't just made a mistake. He'd been morally lost for a very long time. "Call the police, Ethan?" I replied, my voice holding no anger, only a profound weariness. "You think jail is the worst punishment? The real punishment is waking up every morning and having to live with the man you've become. It's looking in the mirror and seeing someone who tried to poison his own mother, who conspired to destroy his father's legacy, and who betrayed an entire community, all for money and out of cowardice." Every word was like a small cut, not deep enough to kill, but enough to make him feel the weight of what he'd done. He flinched. "Your father," I continued, my gaze drifting out the window to where the apple tree stood against the wind. "Your father spent his life protecting the groundwater of this valley. He turned down big money offers, he fought developers, all to make sure that his neighbors' children and grandchildren would have clean water to drink and good soil to farm. And you let your wife poison me to try and poison this whole valley? You went against everything your father ever stood for." I stood up and walked over to him. "You have a choice, Ethan," I said, my voice firm. "One final choice. You can get up, pack your things, and leave like your wife did. Go somewhere I'll never have to see your face again. I won't call the police, but you will no longer be my son. Or," I paused, letting the silence give weight to my next words, "you stay, and you spend the rest of your life making this right." "I'll stay," he whispered, his voice small but certain. The months that followed were the hardest of both our lives. Ethan moved into the old barn that Henry had used as a woodshop. He fixed it up himself, cooked for himself. We lived on the same land but barely spoke. I'd leave a note on his doorstep in the morning with his chores. Fix the barn roof. Clear the brush around the pond. Sort the apples in the cold storage. He did it all without a word of complaint. Ethan, the man who was always afraid to get his hands dirty, now came in every evening covered in mud and sweat, his hands calloused and blistered. I saw him reading Henry's old books on organic farming. I saw him sitting by the creek for hours, just listening to the water. He was relearning the language of the land. At the same time, he started getting help for his gambling addiction. Twice a week, he'd quietly drive into town for a support group meeting. I never asked, and he never told me, but I knew. I could see the change, not just on the outside, but in his eyes. The panic and greed were gone, replaced by a deep, quiet sorrow. As for me, I started my own journey of healing. I couldn't let Henry's legacy just be about preservation. It had to grow, to help more people. I called Walter Miller. "Walter, I have an idea," I told him on the phone. "I want to use a portion of the yearly profits from the apple harvest to start a foundation, the Shenandoah Aquifer Foundation." I laid out my plan. The foundation would have 2 goals. First, to provide free legal aid and counseling to elderly people in our community facing financial abuse or guardianship disputes. I'd been through it, and I didn't want anyone else to have to fight that battle alone. Second, the foundation would fund and guide other farming families in the valley to establish their own land conservation easements, protecting their land from predators like that corporation. Walter was quiet on the other end of the line for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Henry would be so proud of you, Alice. So proud." 6 months passed. One autumn afternoon, I was sitting on the porch going over the books when Ethan walked up. He wasn't looking at the ground anymore. He stood tall, thinner and more weathered, but solid. "Mom," he said, and it was the first time he'd called me that since that day. I finished the eastern fence line, and I cleared the creek, the water's flowing down to the pond again. I nodded. Good. He didn't leave, he just stood there, hesitating. Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The Aquifer Foundation. June told me about it," he said. "It's a wonderful idea, Mom. Is there anything I can do to help? Anything at all? I can drive, lift things, run errands. I don't need to be paid." I looked at my son. For the first time in a long time, I really looked at him. I didn't see the betrayer anymore. I saw a man trying to find his way back to himself. I saw a flicker of Henry in the way he stood, in the seriousness in his eyes. "All right," I said. "Tomorrow, the co-op needs someone to drive the informational packets about the easements out to the farms at the far end of the valley. You can do that." A small, barely there smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am, I'll do it." He turned to leave, and as he stepped off the porch, I called out, "Ethan." He stopped and looked back. "Come inside for dinner tonight," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I made that beef stew you like." He didn't say anything, just nodded, but I could see his eyes were red. He turned away quickly so I wouldn't see, but I did. That night, for the first time in 6 months, we sat at the same dinner table. It was a quiet meal, but it wasn't the silence of distance. It was the silence of a new beginning. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about the farm, the harvest, the neighbors. When we finished, Ethan got up and cleared the plates, something he'd never done in his life. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. "Thanks, Mom, for dinner." "Good night, son," I replied.